Greetings to everyone, my name is Syroyid. I'm Professor of Music Education, Doctor of Musicology, pianist and composer. In today's video, we'll be covering Bach's Invention number 13. So before we begin, I'd like to provide a little bit of background on what are the inventions. It's a set of 15 pieces. Usually they're accompanied with another set of 15 pieces that are called symphonias. So the inventions are written for two parts, as we can see on the screen, whereas the symphonias are three-part pieces. According to the Wikipedia article that we have here in front of us, these pieces were composed as a bundle of 30 short pieces, and they cover different keys. So originally they were written for his eldest son, and you can see that, well, it's a piece that's not only meant to be a study piece for the technique of playing, but also for composition. Actually, the title of the piece, or this collection of 30 pieces, is Forthright Instruction, wherewith lovers of the clavier, and in our case, the piano, the keyboard instrument, especially those desirous of learning, are shown in a clear way, not only first to learn how to play two voices clearly, but also further progress to two, to deal correctly and well with three obbligato parts. So that's the symphonias, right? Moreover, at the same time, to obtain not only good ideas, but also to carry them out well. But most of all, to achieve a cantabile style of playing. So that's the legato that we'll be discussing here, and thereby to acquire a strong foretaste of composition. So the fact that these pieces were written not only for playing, but also for teaching us composition is very telling, and each of the inventions has a very unique structure and different technique, compositional technique. So there is a lot we can learn from it. Unfortunately, the article doesn't really tell us much more about the piece. It only has the introduction of each one. Probably on the internet you can find analysis of this piece, but here we'll really try to dive into a thorough analysis of the compositional techniques. So without further ado, what I'll do is I'll start playing the piece and delimit where the sectional breaks, and once we have that, we'll start commenting. So let's get started. Right, that would be the first idea, because we're here in the main key. Probably I would be using, let's use this darker green to do the sectional divisions, and this is the exposition in A minor, right? We're having the presentation of the main theme. It's being played, as we can see, several times, right? So after that, we have a section that's clearly producing some sort of sequence in modulation. And we arrive there with a perfect cadence on a key of C major. So these sections that are modulating is what we call episodes. And this is the first episode, episode 1, whose goal is to modulate from A minor to C major, which is the relative key, relative major key, right? So there we go. Bach is doing this, carrying out this modulation. Now we have C major here, so that's Exposition 2 in C major. This is how it sounds. Starts with a theme without any accompaniment of the left hand. And there we end this exposition. Right, what follows next is a very long episode, because we won't be finding the theme for quite a long time. So all of this section is clearly an episode, but I would like also to label it as a development. So this is episode 2 with several modulations, and it's the equivalent of a development. Then we'll actually cover a different approach to the structure. So there are different ways you can understand the form of this invention. Let's go. So clearly we're having a cadence here on E minor, but the episode continues. So probably I actually got engrossed into the playing, but we've missed this entrance. So there's one here. So that would be technically the third exposition, right? That's exposition 3, which is in A minor. It's the equivalent of the recapitulation. And after that we have this, which is really like the climactic section because both hands get to play in 16ths. And we arrive to this bottom D sharp, right? And after that, we have the last statement. So this would be another episode. This is episode 3. Which has the climax. And we have here this last one, which is exposition and 4 in A minor as coda. So the coda is really this ending. And it works as a build-up. Eventually resolves to A minor. So we have a clear point of arrival here with that high B, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the highest note of the entire piece. All right, so that would be a little bit the structure that we're seeing. Now, there are two ways you can understand it. The first way to look into it is to regard it as the typical prelude form. So the prelude form is exposition, episode, exposition 2, episode, and so forth. And what we see is that expositions usually are in different keys. So you have there the main key, then this is a contrasting key, and so forth. So that's the prelude form. We actually have seen this in the prelude, the famous prelude BWV 1007, which is the one for cello, right? Where we're seeing that type of structure. That is partly applicable here because we clearly have the exposition 1 in A minor. We have the episode that modulates. We have another exposition in C major. Then we have this episode. What is breaking the rule is that we don't see, once we arrive to E minor, an actual exposition in E minor. It might have sounded like this. And then he would continue there. That would make it a perfect prelude structure with this type of form where we have exposition, episode, exposition. Now, the fact that Bach is doing this episode longer is suggesting us that maybe we're also dealing here with what might look a little bit as a binary form. So what I mean by binary form is that once we get to this point and we make this cadence on E, we might actually return back to the tonic. Right? It might sound like this. Because firstly, it's the middle of the section, it ends on the dominant, which is a very convenient way to go to back to the tonic, and it could be actually one possibility of this binary form, but we don't have the double bar written. So in a binary form, we would find the main key, we would find a modulation, and a cadence on here, the dominant, right? And that would be like the first half. We would have a repeat bar, and then that's defining like the first block. And in the second section, we would have the opposite. So we would start on that contrasting key, in our case, the dominant. We would have what we might call a retro modulation, which is a modulation backwards. And we would arrive to the main key. In that binary principle, it's very evident with this E minor split. So that partly explains why Bach is making this episode longer, because if we look at it from the prelude form, it's just a longer episode. It has two parts, it's double its length. But if we're looking at it from the binary form, this cadence is marking the second half of the prelude. So this is the second half of the invention, and here we have the first half. And with these two halves, we're clearly like dividing the piece into two blocks. Now, having said this, the other question that we're having is, what is the climactic point, right? So clearly, this is the point of maximum movement. We're seeing both hands moving in 16ths. And we are going with a descending progression down to the lowest note, right? It's this D sharp. So I'll put it with blue. So this is like very, very deep. And I think that D sharp technically is the lowest note that we're seeing in the piece, right? I'm scrolling up and down, where we're seeing it again. Here, we're seeing a D natural later on, so it's there. So that is like the first climactic point, but clearly this second one that we're seeing in the coda is the second climax, and it's more significant because we're having a climactic point by reiteration. So once we're repeating something and restating it a second time, it becomes more effective, and that's basically why that one could be technically considered like the climactic point. The previous one could be a climactic section. So let's kind of highlight this, because that's a very important point. Then of course we have this, which is like this maximum movement that's happening there and is being carried. Right, so that's the overview. So now that we have a better understanding of the overall structure of the piece, let's try to understand how it's written at a smaller level. So we're now zooming into the exposition, and the first thing that we notice is clearly a motif that will be giving this red color. So let me remove the highlighting. Yeah, this is going to be red. Maybe we can make it slightly more transparent. There we go. And that red color here is an acephalic motif. It doesn't have a downbeat. So it's sounding almost like a pickup, because the first beat is empty, right? So in that case, also the resolution of the motif should be viewed there. I really like to highlight how this should be phrased, because a lot of the times when people play it, they just get carried away by the 16th notes, and they start to play like a single block of the downbeat. But in reality, what we're having is always a resolution on the next downbeat, which would be properly phrased like that. And that cell is essential, because with that cell, we can explain basically most of the material that is present in the first exposition, which is traveling between right and left hand. So we can see it with these arrows, right? We're seeing that's moving there, up, down, up. So what is left? Well, what we need to explain, of course, is the other notes. So the other notes that Bach is using here are notes that define harmony, right? And the harmony here is always tonic, dominant, right? We can write it like this if we don't need to write the inversions. But the inversions that are happening are fruit of the contrapuntal motion. So we have this imitative counterpoint that is moving between right and left. And it's really worth highlighting the phrasing. But we're seeing at the same time other techniques. Like if we look at the first beat, what we're seeing is an octave jump, and there's a suspension. So this is a very typical type of cadence and suspension that we find in Renaissance music. Right? Which is the tonic that goes to the leading tone and back to the tonic. But it's a clear example of a suspension, right? So that suspension is worth pointing out. We're not seeing the suspension again. So in the exposition, it's only present in this opening. And then the other parts that we're seeing is also like two parts, because if you're looking at it, you have the E. It's almost this alternation between an open string in a second part. And that second part is doing this melodic motion, G sharp to A, leading tone, whereas the other one is a pedal point. Right, so we can hold that E there. And now the second time that the left hand answers, Bach is doing a different technique. So of course here we had the octave jump that I didn't highlight, octave leap. And even if we're phrasing this, the proper way to do it would be, again, considering the leading tone resolving. Right, A, G sharp, A. So now this second repetition is a slightly different variation of that. What Bach is basically doing, he's doing another formula in which we have the first inversion and then the tonic. Now when these intervals are used, Bach is very carefully trying to also get the maximum resonance possible. So for instance, the downbeat with this G sharp is producing a third, which is a very strong interval, whereas this downbeat was a sixth. So in spite of having hollow intervals on beats like this is an 8, an octave, and this is a fifth, Bach is still trying to make sure that the downbeats are strong. Right? And they're contrapuntally getting us to have this full sonority, which resolves from this fifth, I'll put it higher, to a third, right? So we're having there the third. So really, these are the full intervals that are happening. Now, in this case, something similar happens, but since we have the suspension, it's acting almost like a pedal point. So what we're seeing here is a second that goes to a third. Whereas here, well, this is a third, that's a fifth, empty. This is again a sixth, And that's a dissonance, that's a fourth, right? Which is a dissonant interval according to strict counterpoint. So we're seeing these notes, right? When played like that, actually they sound like a canon, because you're seeing that melodic line, and that's the principle. The actual melody is G sharp, A, B, C, which is also played here, and we're hearing them at a distance of 2 notes. So that's kind of the hidden canon. I'll write it here so we can have that reference. Hidden harmonic canon, G sharp, A, and B is where it begins, C. And that's basically how we're getting the set of parallel sixths and parallel thirds. When we're having B in G sharp and B, it's third, and when it's B in G sharp, it's sixth. Right? That's how it basically works. So apart from that, needless to say, the phrase itself is behaving as a period. So what we're feeling, or when we're hearing this, we're experiencing a musical period of 2 measures. So it's a very condensed one, where half of the bar is the opening idea. So this is the opening idea. And then we have a closing idea. And interestingly enough, Bach is managing to create, if I'm playing just the melody, I'm having a tonic, a dominant, and then a tonic. So he is, by avoiding to harmonize that last beat, the 4th beat, Bach is achieving the sense of an opening idea that goes to dominant and an opening idea that goes to tonic, which is the definition of symmetrical period. You have the closing idea in dominant, and then opening idea goes into a closing idea in tonic. That's what we're seeing here. So that's basically the exposition. With this exposition, we can now examine how Bach is working with other expositions. So the second exposition that is happening here presents the inversion. So instead of starting with the right hand, we start with the left hand in the bass, which goes there, and get the answer in the right hand, and then left and right. So interestingly, Bach is avoiding any harmony, so we have no counter melody. And that could be probably because if you want the music to breathe and you would like to create this melodic cantabile legato style about which we have read in the prologue, you really need to not forget about the importance of rests and pauses. So here we have this rest, which is important for breathing, and we are getting another pause here, rest and pause. This one is actually also structural, right, as the previous one. So these are structural points, because once we have the silence, the next section begins, and it's not a coincidence, right? If you'd like to see a different usage of silence, you have this opening one. The opening one here specifically is a rhythmic silence. So that rest is trying to provide the rhythm of the entire piece, right, by that omission of the downbeat. So we are seeing here more of that silence, right? This actually gives us the structural pause because we don't have a pause before that. Whereas in the first exposition, you have the pause within the exposition itself. So as you can see, there's a pause right here, but there we're seeing it right after the episode. So once that's happening, you're seeing a similar pause there, by the way. Once that is happening, the left hand here is a copy and paste of the other one. So this is the equivalent of measure 2, right? Measure 2 was this, that line, which is a very beautiful counterpoint. And this is the equivalent of measure 1, right? So there we can see also that type of inversion. Measure 1 was, and now we're seeing, right? And then the ending, which was this ending that only happened in the right hand, this is measure 2, but right hand, which is also partly that type of inversion, right? So this is what we might call invertible counterpoint, or at least an attempt of inverting an inversion in the presentation of the subjects or the musical motifs, right? So we're having first the left, then the right, whereas in the exposition 1 was first the right and then the left. Harmonically, it's the same thing. We're having tonic, dominant, of course, all of this in C major, tonic, dominant, tonic, dominant, and so forth. It's interesting to notice that when Bach is doing these series of tonic and dominance, he is getting like the full chord, because C major is there present. We have all of the 3 notes of C major. But when we have the dominant 7, sometimes he is removing some notes. And in this case, it's the leading tone. So why is that happening? It's because of the melodic motion, right? The melody would sound different if I would add the third. It actually wouldn't even work. You would get a tritone. So that's why this leading tone is really present here, and we're seeing that note being filling the space here and there. And that's actually what produces a very full sound. If we were not to have it, we would have a very empty sonority. So let's do it. Right, we can see that inevitable leading tone resolving there. That leading tone was happening here too, so let me highlight it. It's this G sharp, G sharp, and G sharp. Actually, the first time Bach is much more interested in presenting that clear leading tone to establish the main key. And this is the second exposition. Right, so the same phrasing applies as we were seeing it before. I'll probably use the same style. So we're seeing these slurs. Right, let me undo that one. It went a little bit wrong. So there we go. And then this one. And we're seeing them here. Right, let's move forward. So now we're going to skip this larger development, which is happening in the middle part, and we're going to the third exposition. As we can see, it's the shortest one, so it's extremely brief, and is the one that has a more clear imitation. So we're seeing the red motif repeated right and left, but also there is this blue motif that's being imitated, right? And that type of crossing of materials is really interesting because it gives a lot of coherence to the musical writing. Harmonically, again, everything is the same, so it's just a set of tonic, dominant, tonic, dominant, right? And this is basically the end of that exposition. And in the last one, we're seeing a slightly different thing, because here it's only one presentation of the theme, which is happening here. And the counter subject that we're encountering is the one that was present here. So it's this pedal point, right? We can put it here. So that's the pedal point. And after that, Bach is doing an ascending sequence. So there's this ascending sequence that is taking us to the climax. That was the pedal point. So in a way, if we're looking at all of these expositions, what we're finding is a long exposition with 4 entrances, then that same exposition with an inverted presentation of the themes on the left hand, right? And it's also 4 entrances. And after that, we're seeing just 2 entrances and then 1. So clearly there's like this condensation, right? Bach is trying to condense and present the themes in a slightly shorter way every time that we're hearing them, right? So this is what's happening there. All right, I'd like to rewrite the legatos because I was a little bit dissatisfied with how they looked in the score. So let's try it there. The E there. Then it goes here. It's always with the resolution. It's also interesting to notice that the pattern itself is the definition of legato. Legato is usually having this ascent in the phrasing and then descent. And we're clearly seeing this in the motive itself. It's going up and then resolving down. So that gives us a lot of this proportion and balance, right? And it's the exact same thing for all of the other expositions. So we might highlight it here. Again. And here in the left hand. And the final one is down there with A minor. And all of these motifs should be actually played in the same way. So you would be expecting to have them with that resolution. Right, so having said this, I think we have all of the expositions. We can clearly see that there is a logic and it's this reduction. So we are going with 4, 4, 2, and 1 entries of the theme. And that's kind of what defines the 4 expositions that we're seeing. Now let's examine the interludes or the episodes. So the first episode, I think it's a very good example of a circle of fifths or a progression that's based around the concept of going by thirds from one key to another. So let's first highlight the notes that are leading this. We can see here that it's this A, right? Let me turn the orange color for that. So we have the A, it goes to D. Now we're having a G going to C. And once that is established, now we're going again A to D, G to C, and F, which is at the subdominant, becomes eventually, well, the leading tone which we have there, F, B. We continue there, but at the same time there is another circle of fifths that starts here, which is D, G, C. So we're kind of seeing that. So it's A, D, G, C. Right, and this A could be carried from the previous D. From E, we would need an E, but there's no E. Well, there is one right here, but it's quite distant. So those are the circles of fifths. Let's put some arrows to connect them. You have the A to D. We're in D minor. G7s, right? That's G7s. And that G goes to C. C7th, right? So harmonically, we're hearing A minor, D minor 7th. Actually, it's also A minor 7th now that I'm noticing. So the harmony is A minor 7th. it goes to D minor 7ths, G 7ths to C 7ths. So that's the first circle of fifths. C major 7ths. And with that, what we're hearing is, well, if we're in C major, it's a 6-2-5-1, right? We can look at it from C major already, because it's 6 is of course the tonic of A minor, but it also becomes the next dominant. I'm not sure why it's doing that. Let's see if it's, yeah, it's better. So there we have it, 5-1. It's a 2-5-1 with the preparation of the 6. And from now on, we have the same thing condensed. So that was basically the exact same progression, but in a condensation. It's A minor, D minor, that goes to G 7th. Well, actually just G, because we don't have the 7th, and it goes to C. So if we're looking it up to here, that's a condensation of the previous section. So it's condensation of measures 3 and 4. First, we have a lengthier exposition of that, and then we have a condensed statement. All right, so here we can see this condensation of the measures 3 and 4. So bars 3 and 4 are A, D, G, C. And now we have the same thing repeated here. By doing that twice, what Bach is doing is he's clearly establishing and defining a stronger sense of the 5-1, which is this perfect cadence on C major. And to make this even more explicit, as you can see, well, there is a new circle of fifths, so probably that's why instead of highlighting that one, I would highlight this. We're seeing it last time here, which is and half a bar, right? So this is a condensation of measure 5.5. And I think that goes very nicely, ties very nicely with the logic that we were already seeing with the tonal plan for the expositions. Remember that the exposition first had 4 entries. We had here again 4 entries. Then we were seeing 2 entries and 1. And now with this episode, we're seeing the same thing. So for half notes, we could say it's for half notes, 2 half notes, and then we're seeing this more condensed version. Actually, well, yeah, it's 2 half notes, and then we have just 1 single half note with in a half, or with that resolution and pickup. So this is really what we're seeing. Now, what is the material that's defining it? Well, before we jump into there is something very nice pointing out too melodically, which is the high note. So we're seeing this F, E, D, and C, which clearly is pointing to the descending nature of the melody, but in the sequence, but it's also the resolution that we're having that leads us to the new tonic, which is C major, right? So probably in order to avoid confusion with this line, I would turn that in orange, because that's kind of the same sort of bass line. And now the other one is the ascending one. So we're seeing that sort of logic. And it's clearly defined by the notes that are syncopated. These are the only notes that have that sustained syncopation, and they go from F, which was the highest note at the moment, so we didn't hear anything higher than A, F, and from F we're descending F, E, D, C to the new tonic. Right, so now we can look into the materials, and I guess the first thing that probably everyone is going to be noticing is that we have this type of descending figuration in 16th notes that very closely reminds us of the rhythm that we might have seen in the exposition. So we're seeing this type of motifs. And notice that I'm actually highlighting them again with the offbeat. So I'm not doing, for instance, in this case, but because that's actually the original logic of the opening. Whereas the other materials that haven't been highlighted are the result of the other material that we were seeing. So having said this, what is the direction of these formulas? Well, these are always descending. That's something we can clearly see. So it's always moving down. We're having the descending figuration. Whereas the other ones are ascending. And we're seeing them always raising up. Right? So they're going upwards, 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 right? And upwards. So this is a very clear, I guess, motion. I would remove the larger arrows because I think they would become overly confusing with the other ones, right? So in the bass one, we have the orange ones. I'd also like to clean them a little bit. So yeah, that's basically it. So now, having this in mind, we can see this idea of counterpoint. It's contracting, expanding, contracting, expanding. We're having a contraction, we're just in a third of a distance. We go to 2 octaves in a sixth. Again a third, and 2 octaves in a sixth. Right, and clearly also the materials are speeding up in the way that they are presented, because here we're hearing the speeding up of the materials is presented first with motifs that are 2 measures, well, 2 beats, sorry, 2 beats, and now we're having just a single beat, 1 beat. So we're basically experiencing this sort of condensation. And where are these materials taken from? Well, the left hand, clearly it's well, the 8th note motive is clearly related or connected to the opening one, whereas the 16th one is a very different presentation, because if we look at the actual motive, originally it was this. Right, we had this pedal point E, but now we're only experiencing thirds. There is a little bit of a reminiscence of the, right, it's present there, but the first part, it's an arpeggio. So what is really giving us a lot of connection, and this is important for players and piano performers, it's that you have to be aware of this little cell, which is the only one that kind of gives us a very strong sense of unity. Whereas the opening, it's just the inversion. So we were having this motive. It was an arpeggio that is there. Now it's an arpeggio too. But what really gives it unity is... So Bach is basically splitting the original idea, which was arpeggio plus this sort of third and second, which was repeated twice, arpeggio and third and second. And now that becomes a longer arpeggio in one instance of that, right? So that's the transformation. We have arpeggio plus arpeggio plus arpeggio, so it's way longer, and then just have the third and second. And that's how that theme becomes this one. And of course, the direction of the arpeggio is the opposite. So if in the beginning we were seeing the raising motion, right, we're seeing that sort of ascent, now we're seeing the descending motion, which was also a little bit carried there, but mainly the descending motion, now it's in the other configuration. So the 16th notes become descending, whereas the 8th notes have the upper leaf and they're going upwards, right? So this is basically how this episode is constructed, right? We can highlight, of course, the other motifs with colors, but I think it's already clear enough. So the only thing that I would probably highlight is, again, the suspension, because that suspension is connected to the original counterpoint. Right, we're having that sort of delayed note. Good. Exposition 2 was already explained, so not much needed to be said. Now we're going to episode 2. As I've said, episode 2 can be clearly seen as two halves, so I would be happy to call episode 2A and 2B. So we have like a clear understanding of these two segments. Here would have episode 2B. So episode 2A is a very good development, because it's basically a transformation of the first episode. It's transformation of episode 1. Where is this happening? Well, firstly, if we look at the materials themselves, they look almost identical. Here we were seeing, now we're seeing and then we're seeing the same syncopation or speeding up, right? So let's try to first see, as we did in the other one, the circle of fifths, if it exists. So we have, right, the C major 7th, right? That's the first harmony. C major 7th. Then that goes to A minor 7th. That's already slightly different than the first time. Then this goes to D, and this is D7, a D dominant. And D7 goes to G major 7th. So by doing this, Bach in a way is like making us here from C major, we're going to G major, right? We have C major, A, which is 2, 5, 1. So 4, 2, 5, 1. And that is being repeated with C major being present again. So let's continue. We see C major. Then from C major, we're going to B7. This is the B7. And the novelty probably is that the B7 goes to E minor, right? And from E minor, we're seeing a very different chord progression. We're seeing again A minor 7th. This time it goes to D. And from D, we're getting G major 7th. That goes to C. And now we have an F sharp half diminished, right? So it's the second degree, and that goes to an instance of B dominant, right? Which in reality, this F sharp is longer. The B7 is clearly here. We're having B7 and E minor, but before that, we're experiencing here probably an A minor 7th. Right? I'm saying probably because, as you can see, the counterpoint is moving very quickly, and you could see technically even 3 chords: E minor, second degree half diminished, A minor, and dominant. Or you could combine all of this and see just the A, C, E, and G as the chord tones, and the B and F sharp as passing tones. Right, that would be the harmony, and then resolves there. So clearly by doing this, I think we already can see some of the circle of fifths. The A going to D and going to G and going to C, right? Then from C, well, the B going to E, A going to D, G going to C, F sharp going to B, and that resolving eventually to E, right? So technically, even if you want to, you could connect it to this F sharp and that F sharp to that C, and that would make a very full and complete circle of fifths. So in this case, the circle is not repeated 3 times, but it's carried away in one single go with a larger stretch, and it's moving very continuously. And the interesting thing is probably what is happening with the Ds. So whenever we're hearing the D and as a chord, we're expecting it to be D sharp if we want to go to E minor, and we can clearly see that being the case when we have like this D sharp. right, or here as B7s, no? But whenever we're seeing the D as part of the circle of fifths, Bach is dealing with it as a dominant of G. So there are two different types of Ds. There are the Ds that are part of G major, sound like that, and then there are the Ds that are part of E minor, which are D sharps. And that is adding a lot of chromaticism to the piece, because here you can see the D sharp, E minor, G major, D natural, back to E minor. Right, so these instances provide a lot of color. So we have here a little relative major feel. So we have a G major, and then we're going back to the E minor, right? Needless to say, E minor is the minor dominant, right? So minor dominant or parallel dominant of A minor. So E minor is the dominant, or actually the parallel dominant of E minor. And with that we have its relative, which is G. Here we have also a little bit of G major, and then back to E minor. And that is how we get from C major. So from C major we first have the C, and then it's actually 4 in G major, so 4, 2, 5, 1. And now the circle of fifths continues. And we arrive to E minor, right? Probably I would, in order to make it more coherent, I would put here the F sharp, right? So that F sharp, it's F sharp diminished, which is technically that chord, which is part of the dominant, right? That's why I would consider all of this as dominant to tonic. Right, so now once we have this, material wise, I guess we'll be seeing the same thing, so I'll just put the red colors here. Now that I'm thinking of it, maybe to distinguish a little bit, since we're seeing so much red, this is a little variation of the motif. We can use maybe orange, right? And that would give us a slightly different feel. So let's maybe update this to orange, and that will actually allows us to see better where the transition is happening, where is the exposition, right? Because these are slightly different variations. I mean, it's not the same to have the arpeggio descending like that or the ascending arpeggio with the first formula. So probably that will also allow me to distinguish them here. That is the first formula, and with the red, we were seeing the second, this was the first, arpeggio third and second, arpeggio third and second, and then the 3 arpeggios are there. Having said this, let's put now the orange here. So that's the formula. The main difference clearly can be seen on the right hand. So instead of having the third and the second down in oblique motion, we're seeing this ascending motion. It's all moving upwards, right? But still, the general principle of contrary motion, where one hand is playing and the other one is stopping, well, it's still applicable. And here probably we have the first instance of more density, because really what we're seeing is the left hand continuing with an answer. So that is actually creating these passages of a climactic feel with both hands and 16th. Remember that is actually what we'll see later on in here, the maximum movement third episode. So both hands will be going in 16th, but it's already anticipated here. So probably when that is happening, let's use the same color, the pink, right? So it's these instances of both hands playing in 16th, right? Well, and clearly, I mean, I didn't highlight it, but these are different materials. These are scales, and that's a double neighbor tone, but they're in 16th notes, so we can connect them probably as that. Good. Having said this, the motion, and we can here apply the same arrows, so it's moving upwards here. Always the 16th, the 8th notes are the ascending ones, and the descending material is primarily in the 16th note. So we're seeing that sort of contrary motion. And it's descending here, going there. Right, so again, probably we're seeing slightly too many arrows because the circle of fifths arrows are overlapping with the other ones. That actually happened here too, so I will actually clean it because otherwise it's going to be too hard to read in the final version. So let's remove the orange arrows that are getting a little bit in the way of the motion that we're seeing. So that's going to be removed. Yep. And here, same thing. So that those arrows are orange. I'll delete them. It's clear for us what they mean. I mean, it's the circle of fifths. That's basically underneath the structure. And the direction with their red and blue, it's, I think, more prominent and clear because it tells us really how everything is moving up and down. So let me complete this. And now I'll add them back with the orange squares. There we go. So we have them here. These are every 4. And that's where they're happening. Right. Good. The last thing that I think that I wanted to say about this is the same principle of the high note, right? So let's highlight it. We have this high C, right? That high C that's appearing first. It's appearing first above. So we have the C, that C goes to B, the B goes to A, the A goes to G, G goes to F sharp goes to E. So in a way, it's the very same principle that we were experiencing the first in the first episode. The first episode was F, E, D, C. And now we're seeing C, B, A, E, G, F sharp, C, and we're getting there to the E as the last note. So that's the first thing, and the other one is the condensation. So like it happened with the first presentation where we're having all of this, now we have a condensed feeling. So this is the condensation of the harmonic rhythm. First, we moved with half notes, and now we have eighth notes, right? So now we're moving quarter notes. We have quarter notes, so it's speeding up. Good. So this is really it. Now that's the cadence that's happening on the E minor. Now episode 2B, because remember that here we might have gone to the beginning. It's very easy to do so, and you could be repeating the opening again if that was to have a double bar, but we're not having it, so now this continues. What we're experiencing here is probably some of the most chromatic harmonies in Bach. So clearly Bach is showing us his knowledge of the diminished chords, but not all of these chords are fully diminished. So here we have C sharp diminished. This is fully diminished, dim 7, right? And now this is B, diminished 7th. But for instance, this next chord, it's not fully diminished, but because what we're seeing is, right? So we're not seeing even one chord. And here actually with that A, 2, that was B, a B half diminished, right? So That's why in some editions you might be seeing that this note is has a question mark, and it could be B flat, A flat, because if it's A flat, we have a fully diminished chord. But if we have an A natural, we have a half diminished chord. And then it changes to diminished. And that's similarly what happens next. So instead of having the F sharp, we're having a G natural. So technically speaking, this is more sophisticated. We're seeing C major, F half diminished. Well, it becomes already diminished. So I would highlight these two chords. C major on the one hand, and on the other hand, D sharp diminished seventh. And that goes to G sharp diminished seventh. Right, so a lot of diminished seventh chord, and none of them really resolves to where it should. Or technically, I mean, they do resolve, but the resolution is very hidden. So let's analyze this. If we have C sharp diminished, that is the leading tone. That's the leading tone of D. Whereas when we have B diminished, that's the leading tone of C. So maybe instead of seeing this as a B half diminished, and that is explaining why we see there the A natural and it sounds so good, is because this C sharp diminished resolves actually to D minor. And that's a very clear progression of 5 to 1, right? So we have, now we have B diminished, going to C major. So this is really the logic behind it. Now this last one, it's G sharp, D sharp, and that's supposed to go to E. And that's where it breaks a little bit. So the D sharp is supposed to go to E, but it resolves to G sharp diminished. How is that possible? Because this is the equivalent of E dominant ninth. So it's a dominant seventh flat 9 chord. With omitted root, you might say, because the root is omitted, or you might find the root here. So that's the root of the chord. So we're seeing a chord that is E, G sharp, B, D, F. Right? So having said this, the harmony is quite straightforward. Now we have C sharp to D, B to C, and now D diminished, D sharp diminished, going to E dominant ninth, and that resolves to A minor. Right? So that is kind of the great logic that's underneath this. Now, how did we get there? We're through a descending sequence. There isn't much secret about that. You have E minor, so it's also having its diminished. Now it's D, C, and B. That B is actually clear to see there, but it leads us to B, E, and A. All right, having said this, let's now highlight the top notes. I guess you can again see the same logic. So it's B flat, A, G, F. All of the episodes so far have the very same progression. They're descending, right? I'll put a different color maybe to the root, because that root is clearly not a part of that line. And the materials that are developed now, they're slightly more organic. So what we're seeing is a very long stretch of the arpeggio figuration, right, which was seen before, and then a short scale. Right, so where was that scale seen before? Well, the scale itself is not something that we've seen a lot, but we can probably first derive it from there. We have this scale, right? And maybe the scale was present. No, it wasn't. It wasn't present before. So this is the first time that we're seeing the scale. Right, so the arpeggios are clearly continuing there. It's the orange. But the scale, it's the new element, which is green. So let's put here the arpeggios, and now we have the scale. Right, these scales probably will be used more. I mean, I can clearly already see how they are present in some of the ladder development. So clearly we're seeing some more of them here, but still, like, the arpeggio still remains as one of the key elements in the future development. So motion-wise, I think it's very straightforward again. Beautiful usage of contrary motion. Right now I'm again noticing that we have a little bit of confusion with the colors, so I'll suggest not to use the blue there. Maybe you can put there the black, as it's the harmony. Right, so that's for this. D sharp going there, and I think I removed a chord. I've removed here B diminished seventh. And let's put its arrow there. Goes to C. Right, and the other line is ascending, and it's clearly doing so here. But it's also truncated, because if you look, it's up, and then we have this big leap down. So when that leap is happening, notice how Bach is carefully doing contrary motion every time. So the bass descends, and the melody is moving upwards in the right hand. Right, this is much more straightforward, because you don't see any movement between, or inversion between the hands, like we were seeing here, that crossing. Now it's all in one hand. And then it resolves there, right? So that's basically the logic behind it. Again, I might actually highlight the rests, as we were doing that with clear blue. So we were seeing the rest here, there are rests there. There was a little rest here, that's a rhythmic one, that's structural, right? So this is structure silence. Whereas the other one is a little breathing, rhythmic silence or rhythmic rest. And here we're seeing many more of them. So there are these that kind of articulate a little bit the motion. So they're making the note detached, right? So therefore articulation. Then we have the rhythmic ones, which are right there at the beginning of each formula. So these are rhythmic. And then we have the one that's used basically for hand crossing. So it's not even a full silence, because what it does, it's basically to transfer one hand to the other, right? And the melody is really continuing there very smoothly with a scale. And that would resolve actually to A. That's what we would expect. We have D, C, B, but Bach is avoiding A, because if he does A, he would end with a hollow interval. And he kind of, with this gesture, what he does is he is returning back to the original formula, which had that truncated motion, right? That leads to the third. And from that moment onwards, we have the third exposition. Right, so this is what we have here. Clearly, because of its chromaticism, so it's the most chromatic and unstable section, it does sound like a development. Carries a development feel. And if we were to look again at this as a sonata, we might see, well, this exposition here, it would end, and then we would have the little development here with all of this instability. Or we might actually see the development starting on the second episode at the beginning, episode 2A. And then we would have the recapitulation clearly in A here. So that would be a recapitulation. Good. So now we have the third episode, which is the last episode that we have before the coda. And in this case, as we already anticipated, we have this maximum movement. It all has a very clear direction, so it's always descending. That's the overall gesture of it. We have here. I really like how these scales connect between themselves. So if you can completely play them, you have C, B, A, G sharp, F, E, D, C, C, B, A, G sharp, right? So in a way, they're a very long connected scale. And the other materials that we were seeing is primarily the arpeggios, right? And I think we were giving them orange color so far. So let's stick to that, the orange color, and the arpeggios are here. So that's the material. And here, I mean, that's a development of the, but we'll get to the coda later. So more things about it. The movement in the left hand, it's clearly an arpeggio. So harmonically, there isn't too much to talk. It's just a tonic, dominant to tonic. And that results to this D sharp. The D sharp is really interesting because it's dominant of the dominant. It's the diminished seventh chord of the 5. It's a D sharp diminished chord, right? D sharp dim seventh. And that resolves into the famous E7. That's the dominant. That goes to tonic. And again, Bach is using first the inversion. So he doesn't resolve into A, he resolves into C. By resolution of the 7th, that goes to the 3rd. You have the 7th going to the 3rd and the leading tone going to A. Good. And what is happening here? Well, it's a very modernistic sound because we have a descending series of thirds. I could highlight you the thirds. You have C, A, F sharp, and D sharp. And all of that basically creates a chord. So we're moving from the tonic, A minor, to the dominant of the dominant, the same diminished D sharp diminished 7th chord that we were seeing later. So in a way, Bach is doing tonic, dominant of the dominant, dominant, tonic, dominant of the dominant, dominant. It's twice the same chord progression. And even to make it more evident, I think it's nice to notice how here the left hand, this left hand is now repeated here. Right, so it's the same thing. And we arrive to a rest. Right before that. So probably now that I'm thinking of this, it's also nice to not think only of these motions, but also to double check the intervals, because it sounds extremely full. And when you look at this, well, Bach is clearly like trying to convey on the downbeats the strong intervals. We have a 6, here we have another 6. You have a diminished 5th chord, right? So a diminished 5th, it's also quite full. There we're having a very dissonant augmented 4th, right? So tritones are used on the downbeat with no shame. Augmented 4th. This would be diminished 5ths. Now this is again a 6th. That's again a 6th. Right, that goes to 3rd, We have another tritone. I'll put just a T, or if you want, I'll be specific. That's a diminished fifth. That goes again to sixth. This is another diminished fifth. So it's present all the time with these diminished and dominant chords. That's dominant. Let's put it lower. That's another third. That's yet another third. That's another third. That's an octave. So this is kind of the type of counterpoint that Bach is conveying. It all sounds quite good because what we're seeing is a broader gesture of the arpeggios, and some of these are also like techniques of counterpoint. So what you're seeing here is this material by augmentation replied there. So here you have an augmentation technique. And the fact that you are experiencing all of these diminished intervals that usually in strict counterpoint they're forbidden, and you would get all sorts of criticism for that, well, is disproven here with Bach's music, because you can clearly see how he is using the tritone a lot, and he's having it there, here, and needless to say, when we have the diminished chords, it's there, right? So we have a lot of tritones. Here probably less, it's 6, but that's a tritone, and it's on the strong beat. Right? This is really the Bach's progression. Right? We have the first tritone here, that goes to another tritone there, and that goes to the next one here, and that descends to this tritone. Right? So these are very strong tritones. And here, as we're basically working on the same concept of dominant, extended, dominant, tonic, dominant of the dominant, it's inevitable that you will be encountering these. Good. So having said this, we're now in the last part, which is Exposition 4. And in Exposition 4, the logic, I think it's quite straightforward. So what we're seeing is the development of the original cell. It's a very beautiful development. A little bit of that scale, the green one. The scale actually, it's further developed here, so we can maybe put it with a darker hue of green because it's for the first time ascending, right? So the scale always appeared here with a descending motion. We had this descent. They're truncated but descending. And now for the first time, right, ascending and through a diminished seventh chord, right? We have this diminished. And that diminished seventh chord clearly creates the climactic point that afterwards just resolves. And here Bach again is teaching us a little bit how to resolve dissonances. So we have the dissonance of B resolved to A. And then we have the little summary of what we were seeing in the episodes. So if you remember, the episodes were this journey of the fourth traveling to the tonic, right? What we're seeing D now, right? I should put the background empty. So it's D going to C, going to B, and going to A. So this is the journey of 4, 3, 2, 1. That's exactly the same thing that we were seeing in episode 1 with 4, F, E, 3, 2, and 1, but it was in C major, right? So we were having this expanded. And now this is C, it's D, C, B, A, right? It's the condensation of episode 1. And that is carried well with a very beautiful diminished third, which is the equivalent of an augmented sixth chord, right? So we have this melodic gesture, right? So harmonically, how we explain this? We have tonic, dominant. The motion is clearly all ascending. So if before in the episode everything was descending down, now we have the ascending sequence, and it's all carrying until this climactic point. And then we have the condensation. So it's descending on the left, ascending on the left and descending on the right. So that's kind of a little bit the motion. Maybe I could connect these maybe better so it's clear. Good. Now, harmonically, it's tonic, dominant, that's again tonic. Now we have an F sharp. So what is the F sharp? That F sharp is part of the melodic scale, right? But in reality, it's just an added note. If you want to give it a structural meaning, you would need to reinterpret the entire chord as an F sharp chord, and that's the 6th degree, right? So it's a 6 half diminished, 6 half diminished, and that would go to G sharp diminished, which is the 7th. It's a dominant that goes to tonic. And now we have a very interesting instance of a Neapolitan chord. A Neapolitan chord, remember, is the flat 2. So when we're having a flat 2, it's this. When we were analyzing the Moonlight Sonata, we were seeing a lot of that. It's a very romantic chord. And by the way it's approached, this tonic becomes here for a moment a relative major chord, or it's a tonic with the 7th if you want it, because it has the G, right? Tonic with the 7th. This is again a dominant. This time it's a diminished 7th chord, as we highlighted earlier, so G sharp diminished 7th, and that G sharp diminished 7th resolves to tonic there, in order to now have a very fast subdominant 4th chord, 4th degree, dominant 7th. That dominant is really moving around because it's across the bar, and it moves to something that we might label technically as a interrupted cadence. Right? So there is the sense of interrupted cadence, but it's a very beautiful one, because normally interrupted cadences are conceptualized as 5 to 6, as I'm playing it there, so I would have 5 and here 6, but Bach is basically doing 5 and doing the bass with the 6 and keeping the diminished structure, and that's a quite novel diminished interrupted cadence. Right? It almost sounds as if we're going to F minor cadence. So cadence. In this case, if that would be F minor, it would be an A flat, and you would have that sort of chord progression. And it's partly happening there, but then it's continuing as diminished. Then we have a diminished dominant of the dominant that goes to this tonic, which is inverted, but it's acting almost as a dominant, and then you have a tonic. So it's what we call classically a cadential 4/6. And here we have the 5/3, and that goes to the tonic. Right. So that is the chord progression. I really like the fact that Bach is trying, even within the smaller motion, to convey the sense of contrary motion. So we have that's ascending, then it's contracting, and this is expanding, right? So we're experiencing all of that. But clearly the maximum point of chromaticism is happening at all of that, and if you want to stretch this climactic point, probably you would need to include all of this into that dissonance, right? You have the B that goes to A that resolves, but then you have this dissonance that's being kept, and it's the highest and the lowest note, right? So according to all of these ingredients, probably that would be the main climactic point of the piece. And it's a very well tailored piece because you have multiple points of tension. The first one, of course, experiencing here with the modulation, and here condensing that, here with both hands moving. Then we have the diminished, which is also an increase of tension. Both hands moving for a longer period, going to the lowest note. And then we have the highest and the lowest with this chromatic harmony and interrupted cadence, right? So this would be pretty much it. I think that it's true that the title of the piece says what it is. I mean, it's a study not only of piano performance, but as you can see through all of these different annotations that we've made, it's a study of music composition. And I think that in this case, Bach is presenting us the finest compositional techniques that he had at the time, all of them condensed just in these, two pages of music, right? So I encourage all composition students to study all 15 inventions. I think there's plenty that you can learn. And of course, apart from the inventions, you can study the symphonies that have 3-part writing. All right, so this is basically what we had for today. I'd like to thank you all for staying here with me. There's a Patreon channel in which you can find more materials. Basically, you can find the PDF files of the scores that I'm annotating here. And I'm now opening in the classroom the option of having group lessons. So this is something that you can experience there. I encourage you to read the info that is in the page. And also there is the option of composers receiving feedback. So if you'd like to receive feedback on your piece, you can sign up on Patreon and find the option that allows you to do that. Currently, I'm reviewing 3 minutes of music a month, so that could be a good starting point for you to receive feedback. Of course, at the same time, if you'd like to receive more structure instruction, feel free to reach out to me via email and book some composition lessons so we can tailor a specific syllabus for your training and try to provide you with the best tools for improving as a composer. So without further ado, I'd like to thank you all and see you next week. Happy composing.